Order, please. We'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please note for the record that Councilperson Solis is not with us tonight. We still have a quorum. And welcome to everyone here tonight. We'll begin with the items from council, which I believe are some proclamations.
Yes, we have a couple of proclamations on the list, and the first one has to do with the city's Parks Department, and this is signed by Mayor Raleigh McCoy today, and it reads in part, whereas our parks and recreation are vitally important to establishing and maintaining the quality of life in our communities, ensuring the health of all citizens, and contributing to the economic and environmental well-being of a community and region, and whereas parks and recreation programs increase a community's economic prosperity through increased property values, expansion of the local tax base, increased tourism, the attraction and retention of businesses, and crime reduction. And whereas our parks and natural recreation areas ensure ecological beauty of our community and provide a place for children and adults to connect with nature and recreate outdoors. And whereas the U.S. House of Representatives has designated July as Parks and Recreation Month, now therefore I, Raleigh McCoy, Mayor of the City of Victoria, Texas, do officially declare the month of July to be recognized as Parks and Recreation Month in Victoria, Texas. Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
It's okay. The second proclamation on our agenda tonight is for the Watch Your Car Month, and it reads in part, whereas unlocked vehicles and keys left in or near vehicles contribute to a significant number of motor vehicle burglaries and thefts throughout the state. To combat motor vehicle burglary and theft, the Texas legislature has created the Texas Motor Vehicle Crime Prevention Authority. And whereas Gary P. Nunn has been appointed the Ambassador of Texas, and on Wednesday, April 10th, 2019, the Texas House and Senate honored Mr. Nunn. Whereas Gary P. Nunn has joined with the Texas Motor Vehicle Crime Prevention Authority and local law enforcement to create the If You Like It, Lock It campaign on radio, television, and other media. They have identified that one way for all Texans to reduce motor vehicle theft and burglary is to watch your car and remember, if you like it, lock it. Now, therefore, I, Raleigh McCoy, Mayor of the City of Victoria, Texas, do officially declare the month of July 2019 to be Watch Your Car Month in Victoria, Texas, with special emphasis on alerting citizens to lock their vehicles, take their keys, and hide their belongings. Watch your car, and if you like it, lock it. Yeah. I'm not sure. Chief, do you have a representative here to receive the proclamation?
Thought maybe Gary P. Nunn was gonna be here.
What's the deal?
We could have a musical interlude if he would show up.
There's no Gary P.
That's cool.
He was on the campus, taking pictures with everybody.
Right. That's awesome.
Okay, we'll move on to citizens' communication.
Oh,
What-
Mr. Mayor, there's
any
still
more
more.
items?
Yeah,
Right,
I
excuse me.
was going to let you do the proclamations first. I'd like either some clarification or have staff look at public camping / homelessness camping throughout the city. What are, if we have any ordinances and how do we go about regulating it? We have an issue, multiple people have contacted me in regards to homelessness in neighborhoods now. So that was something that got brought up that I thought I'd let staff look at options and bring that back to us.
I appreciate you bringing that up. I've had a couple of phone calls today myself, and you're right, we don't have anything currently on the books that relates to that. A year or two ago, I gave a presentation to council that I'm sure you remember that dealt primarily with panhandling, but also touched briefly on camping. I could brush that off and look at, I know that some other cities you've mentioned have passed ordinances lately. I could look at what some of the other options are and bring back some recommendations if you'd like.
Thank you.
Any other items from council? If not, we'll move into citizens' communication. Anyone that's here to speak to a matter not on a public hearing, please step forward. We give you 5 minutes to speak, and generally, the council does not interact with persons that come forth to speak. So is there anyone here to speak to any items that they wish to? Seeing none, we will move on. There are no items from public hearing, so I guess we'll move on to the consent agenda.
There are 4 items on the consent agenda tonight that will be approved by a single vote. They are first, the approval of minutes of the regular meeting on June 18th, 2019. Second, the resolution authorizing the city manager to execute a renewal of the contract with Roxanne Calvo doing business as Cleaning Pro Janitorial Services for janitorial services in the amount of $29,700 and declaring an effective date. Third, a resolution authorizing the city manager to execute a contract with Harrison and Waldrop Yoharrick LLP to perform the city's annual audit for the year ending September 30th, 2019 in an amount not to exceed $48,000 and declaring an effective date. And fourth, an ordinance amending Chapter 22 of the Victoria City Code to revise speed limits, repealing parts of conflicting ordinances, providing for a penalty not to exceed $500 upon conviction, publication, and savings, and declaring an effective date.
Move to adopt the consent agenda as presented.
Second.
Been moved and seconded to adopt the consent agenda. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Consent agenda passes. We'll move on to item E.
E1 is a resolution authorizing the city manager to execute the pass-through agreement for payment of pass-through tolls by the Texas Department of Transportation, Amendment Number 1, and declaring an effective date.
Move to accept item E1.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to accept item E1. All those in favor say aye.
Hold on, just a
Oh, I'm sorry. Is there
little
any
discussion. I'd like
All right.
to,
Thank you. Mayor,
little thing.
council,
Head
thank you
down,
for
ready to go.
Ready to go, ready to go.
You can vote that through with no problem. I have a quick PowerPoint I want to show y'all, maybe explain some of the hot background where this project came from, how it developed, and a quick talk about the present value discount rate of 6%. I know there's a lot of confusion. I've been hearing that it's a discount of 6. No, it's not a discount of 6, it's a discount rate. So I'll talk about that. But first of all, a little background. As you recall, the City of Victoria and TxDOT mutually agreed to construct, 4 main lane divided with overpasses, frontage roads from Salem Road to Mockingbird. Okay, can you hit that slide? 3? I don't have it. There you go. Thank you. So you're looking about 1.9 miles from Salem to Mockingbird. So that was the project in itself. And keep in mind, when this was talked about, this is back in 2008, 2009, TxDOT had this project kind of shelf ready, but the money wasn't there from the state funding to move forward with the project. So that's where the City of Victoria stepped in. MPO in 2009 submitted what you call an overpass toll agreement with TxDOT, where basically it tells TxDOT, and if they agree, we'll upfront the money, and we get reimbursed on vehicle usage, in other words, per mile. So after a while, in 2011, can you go? I go back. That's right. I can do it now. Oh, now you killed it for me. So while he's doing that, keep in mind, this project was always intended to be a public safety project. It was, not only that, is that if we combine our resources, we have a cost and savings in the construction of an overpass and the road at one time. And, no, yes? Okay. With that, let me move on. The agreement was executed and agreed in January 2011. So that's where it was signed, contracted by both parties. So anyway, the total cost of the project, thank you. Okay, now. All right. The total construction cost of the project is $18 million. City upfront, $15.9 million, of which 9.7 were bond money, and the remaining 6.2 was local funds that we submitted with that package over 2 years, basically. TxDOT will reimburse the city 12 cents for every mile from the Salem to Mockingbird. Every time there's a counter there, you can't see it. I try to go through it every day so I get a little extra cash, but there's a counter there. So TxDOT will reimburse us annually per vehicle, per mile, 12 cents. And we average about 18,000 vehicles through there. Per contract, TxDOT will not pay us more than $1.8 million. That was the highest number. In other words, if you had X number of vehicles and generated 1.9, they will not pay us that. They'll pay the max of 1.7. And then, of course, over the life of the contract, we won't get 19.3. That's the maximum number they'll pay out. Now, this amendment, what they want to do is say, hey, guys, let's terminate the contract. I'm willing to pay up the remaining balance of $11.1 million. How that 11.1 is determined, basically, if you take that $19.3 million, which is the max that they pay out, and I don't know if you saw the package, there's $8.1 million we have received to date. The difference of that is that 11.1. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's they're saying, I'm going to use this $11 million to calculate the present value of that over their life with a 6% discount. I'm not going to discount at 6, I'm going to present value it, okay? So let's talk about the present value. Real quick, have y'all have this? I think I passed out briefly. The first page, page 1 of 5. I have received 6 payments from TxDOT. It's right there from 2014 all the way to 2019. Those 6 payments average about $1.36 million, 1.4. That is what I received over the life of the contract so far. Now, if you flip the page, this is what it's nice about this proposal. They're offering to pay us out the 1.756, no matter what. I said, that's great. That's why I'm okay with a 6% discount rate. If there comes a deal, we're willing to pay out the average of 1.3, then I would come back and say, okay, that discount rate needs to be about 3 or 4. Because if you recall, the lower discount rate, the higher the payout. The higher the discount rate, the lower the payout. It's just inverse relationship, okay? So with that, over the next they're going to take 7 years. They're going to use that $1.75 million of maximum pay at a discount rate of 6% per the year. And we end up coming out with $9.6 million cash. It's a calculation. TxDOT did it. I did it. We agree. I think that's a solid number. I think Ms. Scott's husband really did it too, just to verify me. Does that make sense? I'll make sure people understand discount rate, not a discount off the number. Okay. So basically what happened here, we got the project was implemented. The safety structures were in place, so it was a win-win situation for the City of Victoria and TxDOT, the county as well. Overall, there's an important key. We netted a positive cash flow from this whole project, and that's a good thing. Now, one of the things we want to do with the proceeds, we want to use the rest, it's about $3.1 million to pay off the bonds. It's done, finito. So we have an average of 8-year life instead of having 20. Originally, when we start planning this years ago, I would expect anywhere from 11 to 12 years payout, but this is going to speed it up real quick. And of course, management is going to come back with a proposal to council and show you how the remainder of the funding will be used and allocated throughout the budget or whatever items he wants to present to council at the next meeting or down the road. Okay? Overall,
And just really quick, realistically, we're probably looking at some time frame in the fall. We realistically don't really want to go down that path until we actually get the money, actually pay out what we owe. And so this isn't something that I foresee being talked about during this budget process because we want to wait till we actually get the money.
good point.
How much is saved in the bond interest?
Okay. You had to throw me a curve. I didn't look at that. Well, at that 9.7, we would have paid out close to $16 million. So you're looking anywhere $4 to $5 million in interest savings. And every year we did some savings because we came back and called in some callable bonds. We always try to reduce. So there's a huge savings there. Of course, as you well know, if we were paying off in 8 years, I can get you that number tight.
But it goes against the discount rate, so we're better off.
Oh, we're absolutely.
So it reduces that
Absolutely.
discount rate.
Absolutely. So we're in good shape. So back to Mr. Garza's comment, he's absolutely right, because once this is done, council approves it, goes back to TxDOT, you got lawyers talking to each other and everything else. And the check sometime August, September, and then still, that's where the fall place comes out. Okay? That's all I have, folks. I hope y'all approve it.
Now, any discussion?
No, thank you for bringing that to us. That was you, Gilbert.
Oh,
Thank you for bringing that to us.
well,
Okay.
it's always been a group effort.
So I think we have a motion and a second already on the floor. So all those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Passes 7-0, or 6-0. All right. We will now move into city manager reports.
All right, good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Before I begin going through the presentation, I just want to remind you and remind the public of the 4th of July event that will be taking place on, yes, you guessed it, 4th of July, at the Community Center from 6 to 11 p.m. I want to also thank Hartman Distributing for the fireworks show, which will be at 9:30 p.m. So, of course, we invite you and all the public to come out and have a good time. So, all right. So as it relates to the presentation, as was mentioned it's all a blur, because last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever we had our last budget workshop, I committed to following up to talk a little bit about personnel and the vision that I have for the organization and staff, but more importantly, to loop you into some of the conversations that have been taking place with some stakeholders and even just us internally as staff. Before I go through that, I wanted to briefly remind council that if you may recall, I'm on a very specific 100-day plan where I committed to look at all of these areas of the organization. I'm not going to run through them, but I want to point out the fact that some of these were very specific and are relevant to today's topic. Leadership and management structure is an example, internal efficiency is another one, and even technology to a degree. Obviously, I'm nowhere near doing the assessments in all of these areas, and quite frankly, it's probably going to take me longer than 100 days. But nonetheless, it's an ongoing conversation. And so I want to provide that as background. Also, through my interview process and even through some of the conversations that I've had with council, it's also become evident to me that there is this desire for us to be more intentional as it relates to quality of life issues in our community. I think everybody understands that there is a correlation between quality of life and economic development, which of course is an item that I've talked about to a pretty significant extent with you and stakeholders. We already do some of this. Of course, we already have a Parks and Recreation effort. We already do the retail recruitment that's spearheaded out of the city manager's office through John. And there also has been conversations related to downtown redevelopment. It was talked about during my interview, and has been talked about in several occasions since that time frame. In the time that I have been here, which has been, gosh, 6 weeks maybe, there has been some things that I've already observed that I want to try and take advantage of this fiscal year budget development process, if you will, to start making some changes in fiscal year 20. I'm a big believer in making organizational changes consistent with the fiscal year, because I think it's easier to track sort of our successes with organizational changes if we can kind of tie them to a budget. So that's why I'm kind of bringing these issues up now as opposed to waiting, because I don't want to wait till fiscal year 21 to start working towards some of the goals that I have. But in the short time that I have been here, there's been a few items that have stuck out to me. I believe there are areas of opportunity as it relates to our building maintenance. I've made some comments to you and even at meetings that as it relates to our facility needs, they're not as broad as I think they need to be. And so the idea is, how can we not only improve responsiveness to the day-to-day issues, but how can we better plan for the future needs of our community, or even just better have conversations about what our needs are. To that end, there are some components that tie into technology. I mentioned that one of the assessments I want to do is just assess where we are from a technology standpoint. And what I mean by that is, how do we stand as it relates to using technology to our advantage to be more efficient as an organization, to our advantage to be more accessible to the public. There's a lot of tools out there that exist that cities are sort of slowly but surely growing towards that. We're missing some opportunities to take advantage of that because of just how we're structured. And how we're structured, in my opinion, to an extent, is a reactive structure. And so I wanted to spend a minute talking about this concept of proactive versus reactive structure. Some of it is pretty common sense, but in essence, the idea is that we want to be, at least in my opinion, we want to be proactive in the sense that we want to catch issues before they happen. We want to be proactive in the way that we communicate to employees, in the way we communicate to the public. We want to be proactive in being intentional with efforts that we're working towards, as opposed to simply focused on putting out fires, as opposed to simply focused on just reacting. One sort of perfect example, and I don't mean to call out the police department, but I wanted to come up with an example. But historically, police departments were reactive, right? You'd call, they'd come out and respond. But through time, policing work has evolved to include crime prevention, educational efforts. They've evolved to include community policing techniques. So there's been this shift in the police world to get away from being solely a reactive police department and being a more proactive police department. But that also applies to every single operation that we have with the city, not just the police department. And so the idea is, are we structured to be proactive in every department? And quite frankly, the answer is no, at least not right now. So I already mentioned one of these, but before I get into the suggestions, some of the other things that have played a role into this is sort of these two items that I have on there. When I came on board, the Main Street, which, as you know, is a nonprofit entity, had an interim director. And so it sort of lent and made for perfect timing for Main Street to have conversations with the city, which from my understanding started before I even started, actually, just to see how could we work better together for the benefit of downtown. And as most of you know, our great OC Garza is retiring, and so that creates an opportunity for us to also reassess our communications department. By the way, thank you for your service. Everybody will get an invite to the pachanga. That's the party. So the idea is, and I'm kind of not in any particular order, but one of the ideas is to create a new department and call it the Building and Equipment Services Department, or BESD for short. This is not an uncommon department that exists in other organizations. And the idea is to take fleet, which currently is under environmental services, and take building maintenance, which currently is under IT, to create this new department. We feel fairly confident that we can accomplish this vision with existing resources, just sort of moving the chess pieces around budgetarily with what's already been approved and even with the positions that we have. But the idea, as I mentioned previously, is to increase the focus on building maintenance and responsiveness, but also looking at our facility needs long term. There's been a lot of conversation about the facility needs of the police department, but quite frankly, we should be having conversations about what the facility needs are of the entire organization, not just one department. And it's difficult to even have that conversation if we're not structured intentionally to be more proactive in looking at that issue. On that note, I know Councilwoman Solis isn't here, but she brought up the issue of beautification at the last council meeting. And so the idea is, by removing fleet away from environmental services, is to create a new division under the environmental services director, and refer to that as the community appearance division. Part of that effort is to reinvigorate and reestablish Keep Victoria Beautiful. That's actually a huge asset of ours that has been lost. In the history of its existence, it's sort of gone back and forth between the city sort of running it being run by nonprofits. The reality is that this is an effort that, if it's not spearheaded by the city, the likelihood of it being successful is very slim. It's not uncommon for cities starting to sort of spearhead these efforts. And so the idea is, how can we be more intentional about reinvigorating, reestablishing Keep Victoria Beautiful? And the answer is, well, we'll do it, right? And I couldn't think of a better person to do it. Darryl has previously served as the president of Keep Victoria Beautiful, and he's already undertaken some projects within his existing resources. And so I think that's a perfect fit. Part of that exercise is to also look at the quality of life issues that I mentioned related to Parks and Rec. I hope Kobe doesn't mind this, but one of the first conversations that I had with Kobe, he said, it'd be nice if parks could get back to focusing on parks. And the reality is that through time, there's been different things that have been shifted to parks that, sure, they're somewhat related, but at the end of the day, I think we would get better service from Kobe and his team if they could focus more on parks. And so the idea is to transition some of the community beautification items away from parks that they currently focus on, landscaping, right-of-way maintenance as an example, and transition those over to the new community appearance division. And again, these are things that we can do with existing resources, just moving the chess pieces around. But it'll help us be more intentional with what we're trying to do. Now, some of the additional benefits of that reorg would create capacity for some of the departments involved. So on the IT front, obviously by moving building maintenance away from IT will create some capacity for us to have conversations about these missed opportunities that I referenced earlier as it relates to how we could use technology to be more efficient and be more accessible to the public. On the park side, the idea is to focus more on planning for parks and also recreational needs. Oftentimes people forget the recreational part from Parks and Rec. He mentioned during his budget workshop, some adult leagues that we're going to get into. And so it's part of the vision for us to create sort of more recreational opportunities in the city, and hopefully alleviating about 20% of Kobe's and his management team's time could help us be better at that. Now, as it relates to the communications opportunity, you may or may not be familiar with the fact that currently our CVB falls under the communications director, which of course is Mr. Garza. And so the idea is to split those apart and have CVB treated as an independent department, which is not uncommon. Joel, who even presented the tourism budget at the last budget workshop, we don't even treat him as an executive. In the 6 weeks that I've been here, I maybe have interacted with him once because there is no direct link between the CVB and the city manager's office, which I think is a mistake, since CVB plays a huge role in economic development, and we could be more intentional about those efforts that are going on there. Now, what this would do with the split is alleviate about 35% of the next director's time to hopefully focus on rebranding our communications department. It doesn't really cost us much money to change the name of it, but the goals of the department would change. So for example, by it being a department or a director of communications and public affairs will allow us the ability to focus more on interacting with the community. There are a lot of things that cities are doing now that are best practices that we're not undertaking. So as an example, a lot of cities now do community surveys. A lot of cities do community focus groups. There's a lot of things that cities do to engage the public that we currently are not structured in a way to be able to do. Even the budget process is an example. The amount of public input that goes into the budget development process is very minimal, except for the public hearings that we have here. But it's not uncommon for there to be more robust resident and community feedback opportunities. But that's difficult to do if we're not structured in a way where we can facilitate some of these interactions with the public. Outside of that, I think we could do a better job in being proactive with telling our story. If we are not telling our own story, we're letting others tell our story for us, and they may not always get it right, or they might get it incomplete, or they might just miss the boat completely. And so the idea is for us to more strategically focus on telling our story, because I could tell you that a lot of the things that I heard coming into this role are not true. I think there are a lot of perception issues, and I think we just need a better marketing and a better proactive effort to curb some of those mindsets that exist about what our community is, what it has to offer, and things of that sort. On the downtown Main Street front, as you know, Main Street currently already is funded through the city. So, well, let me go back real quick. On this end of it, the idea is to utilize existing resources to do it. So this, again, this is just playing with the chess pieces to change things. On the Main Street side, they currently receive funding, hot funds, about $75,000. A little bit of background. So Main Street started in 2011, 2012 timeframe. At that time, the only way Main Street could be started was if it was an independent nonprofit. Main Street is sort of a state organization that's kind of funneled down through the Texas Historical Commission. And at the time in 2011, 2012, it was not even an option for a city of our size. Well, I shouldn't refer to it that way, but it was more common for these entities to be registered nonprofits. Since that time, they've changed the rules to allow cities to be more involved with Main Street, because similar to the issues as to why Keep Victoria Beautiful failed, is the same reason why a lot of main streets across the state are failing, because the city's not directly involved with it. And when you have an entity that solely relies on volunteers, it's going to be an inconsistent operation. It's not bad, it's not good, it's just the reality of it. So what we're working with and having discussions with the board of directors for the Main Street is trying to just be more intentional with how we can be better. One of the options is to establish a hybrid structure, which is not uncommon. There are a lot of cities that have this type of structure. And the idea is for the nonprofit to continue to exist. The board will continue to exist. There's value in having a nonprofit associated with our downtown, as it might facilitate fundraising, it might facilitate chasing after grants. But the director coordinator of Main Street would be a city employee, and that'll improve, in my opinion, it'll improve accountability and a few other items, which I'll get into in a second. But the other option would be to just continue doing what we're doing in terms of funding the nonprofit. However, I do think that if we land on that option, we need to do a better job of establishing deliverables in the funding agreement that we have with Main Street, because I do think there are things that need to be improved. And so regardless of whether we do it ourselves or they continue to do it on their own, I think we need to be more intentional as a city in terms of what our expectations are of Main Street, regardless of where it ends up. I already talked about some of these things, but one of the things that Heather, who's the interim director, has slowly but surely brought forward to the board, I think, is just the concept that Main Street follows sort of statewide, which is the 4-point approach, which focuses on organization, promotion, design, and economic vitality. So there is sort of a very structured methodology and effort that Main Street brings to the table that I think is where Main Street needs to focus on. And again, whether we take it on as a city or it stays as a nonprofit, we need to ensure that they're working towards focusing on these areas. Now, in terms of how I want to piece everything together, this is probably where the most of the feedback comes in. And this is the part that would require additional funding. Everything I've talked to up until this point wouldn't require any additional funding, but this part would. So for context, when I first started doing research, when I was interviewing for this position, I'll be honest with you, I was a little surprised at the fact that the city manager's office only had one assistant city manager. In my experience in other communities, or even just knowing and being involved with the City Management Association, it's not uncommon for a city of our size to have 2 assistant city managers or even more. So I went through the exercise of doing a comparative analysis. That's sort of the information you have on the right. I made it very simple. I said, we're at 67,000. I'm going to go 10,000 below, 10,000 above, and just capture all the cities that fall within that range. And you'll see that Victoria is the only one that doesn't have either 2 or more assistant city managers. And the reason for that, quite frankly, is there's just a lot going on, right? And there's only so much that one person can tackle. And if the idea is that we want to be more proactive instead of reactive, well, then we would need more time to be able to do that. Here, I think the opportunity not only stems from being more proactive versus reactive, but also the idea of an opportunity of bringing a second assistant city manager to focus on economic development. So the idea is consider adding a second assistant city manager with an economic development background or experience. This person would absorb, and I'll go through it in another slide, would absorb a lot of the departments that touch the hotel occupancy tax and some of the quality of life components. But more importantly, this person would serve as staff support for the Sales Tax Development Corporation. I've sort of tried to come up with an easy way to sort of explain this void, and I mentioned this to staff at the meeting yesterday, but I see this void clear as day, and so I need to try and find a way to sort of effectively educate everybody on this missing piece. But one way to think of it is, let's think of all the other boards that the city has, right? We have the Planning Commission, and so the question would be very simple: who staffs and supports the Planning Commission? A planning professional, right? Whenever our community undertakes comprehensive planning efforts, which commission is responsible for that? The Planning Commission. They're the ones that were involved with, for example, the 2035 plan that the city underwent. If we look at other boards, right, the library board, who staffs and supports that board, right? A library professional provides the resources for them to do their job. Our parks board, who staffs that? A parks professional. We have an informal tourism group that, as you all know, reviews some of the funding, but who staffs and supports that group? Tourism professionals. And so the big question mark is, who staffs and supports our Economic Development Board, which is the Sales Tax Development Corporation? And the answer is that it's not an economic development professional. Through the years, of course, Thomas and Gilbert have done a great job in supporting that board, but there's been a missing component with that board that has, in my opinion, prevented it from truly having conversations about strategic planning, or even more proactive conversations about what are we doing from an economic development standpoint. Now, I'm not the only one that has noticed this void. Dale in the past has sort of interjected himself to try and fill this void of supporting this board, but of course, he doesn't work for the city, right? So there's been attempts there. At times, I wouldn't be surprised if Gilbert and Thomas have also sort of interjected with some recommendations to the board, as best they could. And so others have seen this void, and I think this void could be filled by this second assistant city manager with economic development experience. So if we were to do all that, this is what it would look like with the second assistant city manager. Really quickly, I do want to point out something that was intentional with this org chart. So typically the city secretary would have been a red box, but I think it's important that I highlight that one of the things that I want to focus on too is sort of increasing the role and presence of our city secretaries, city clerks, whatever you want to call it, all across the state are pretty high statured positions. A lot of cities have them comparable to city managers, to city attorneys. And so I want to start sort of working towards our city secretary function serving more at that traditional role as opposed to just being another director, because I think it's much more than that. So that's intentional. And so you could see how here we've incorporated the new department-ish, if we want to call them, the building and equipment services, and then also the Main Street is under this. I'll take these one at a time. So as far as sort of what I would retain if we were to do these, of course, all of these departments, I'm not going to go through them. But at the very bottom, though, in terms of additional key responsibilities, having a second assistant city manager will allow me the time to be able to do strategic planning with you and be more proactive about what we're doing overall as an organization. One of the things that's not on here and that's not on our org chart is the emergency management sort of perspective that I think in the future I need to try and find a better way to incorporate, because that's a big piece that deserves more attention from the city manager's office. That again, it's difficult to do with the current structure because there's not a lot of time. The assistant city manager number one, AKA John, would retain the many of the big functions that he has now. But more importantly, there would be some that would be sort of shifted over away from him to the new assistant city manager. Notably, the retail recruitment. John has done an excellent job in working with the retail coach, which is our consultant for retail recruitment. But quite frankly, in my opinion, we haven't even scratched the surface with the potential that we have on retail recruitment and retention. So that would be shifted over to the second assistant city manager, so somebody could dedicate more time towards that effort. But the idea too, by moving parks as an example, shifting that, I should say, away from John, is to I can't think of a better way to say this, but take advantage of John's experience with planning. He's obviously an excellent planner, and I think that he could help us continue the conversation for the comp plan, for the development code, conversations that have been inconsistent because they just slip through the cracks because there's just not a lot of time. So the idea is sort of place those responsibilities on John. Second assistant city manager, as I mentioned, would take on some of the economic development roles or functions. Those would include parks and recreation. That would include the new Main Street if it comes under the city. And that would include the new sort of, I shouldn't say new, but CVB treated as a department on its own, as in my opinion, as it should. And of course, the library. The library is in here because I think the library plays a big role in downtown since it's located on the main street. I think there are some opportunities there. And what you'll notice once and I'm not going to go into the weeds, but once you actually get into the weeds of a lot of these operations, there's hotel occupancy tax is consistent. You know, I mentioned how one of the 4 approaches of Main Street is promotion. So the CVB would be under the same person. I talked about the retail recruitment and Sales Tax Development Corporation. Sales Tax Development Corporation has funded park projects. So the more you start diving into what the resources are with these functions, the more they start making sense to fall under the umbrella of one person that can help us be more intentional and strategic on how they can work better together. And I know that the slide looks thin, but trust me, there's a lot of areas of economic development that we just don't have the time because there hasn't been somebody dedicated to it to be able to focus on. I'll point to the 2015 economic development policy that the city adopted. There were a lot of recommendations in that 2015 policy that nobody really has looked at in detail because, again, there's no time for somebody to. So as an example, that policy talks about a tax increment reinvestment zone. It talks about public improvement districts. You know, it talks about neighborhood empowerment zones. And now there's a concept of opportunity zones, as an example, that just came out a couple years ago. But again, we don't have anybody with the expertise or time to focus into being more intentional with looking at these opportunities. So even though this slide looks thin, the potential for it to become meatier, if you will, is there. So funding, right? That's probably the question on everybody's mind. So in order for us to hire the second assistant city manager would have about a $200,000 upfront expense that not only would include compensation, but obviously we would have to look at increasing my office's training and travel budgets, membership budgets, office supplies, and then there'd be some upfront expenses because of just needing to be furniture. The office space is already there in between John's office and my office, so it would simply be a matter of furnishing it. And because of everything that I discussed and the role and the function that this position would have, we feel that it's appropriate to fund this cost 3 ways, between the general fund, between the hotel occupancy tax because of its role supervising obviously the CVB and Main Street, which would be 2 hotel occupancy tax related functions, and the Sales Tax Development Corporation, since it'll provide that service to them in terms of staffing it. You may or may not be aware that the city already has an administrative services contract with the Sales Tax Development Corporation, but up until this point, it's primarily been focused on project management, engineering, and so in our opinion, it wouldn't be that difficult to simply amend that agreement and incorporate some administration aspects to it. This would, in my opinion, still comply with the promise to the voters because the Sales Tax Development Corporation is still not directly hiring somebody. This would simply just be one part of this job's role within my office. Now, if that happens, this is what the personnel numbers would look like for next fiscal year. It would increase by 2, those being the ones that I've talked about, the ACM, which really would be the only one that would necessitate additional funding because the additional position would come from the already $75,000 that we already allocate towards Main Street. We would simply just be adding that position to our FTE count. Next steps in all of this would be for us to complete the budget process. That would be sort of the big, especially with the position that requires additional funding, that would be the big nod of approval, from council to proceed with that as we complete that. In the meantime, we'll continue to work with the Main Street Board on finalizing what we want to do there. And with everything else, since those are things that completely fall under my purview, we're just working on those and trying to make them happen. And again, those things are simply just reshuffling the chess pieces. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And just to clarify, I'm not asking you to approve anything, today. This is merely a presentation. The approval would come when the budget gets approved and the additional funding gets allocated to my office. I'll tell you that the budget that was presented at the budget workshops 2 weeks ago would not be impacted by any of these changes. We had already anticipated me coming forward to you with all of this, and so it wouldn't change anything that you've already heard. So I just want to clarify that. Any questions, comments, concerns?
I'm just gonna need a little time to digest it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot of stuff. Thank you for your time.
For one question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Just for clarification, and I think I do understand this, and you and I talked about it a little bit, but when you talk about economic development, there are all kinds of aspects to that. And the economic development that you were talking about, that the city would undertake through the new position was dealing with the things we're doing right now, the retail coach and hotel occupancy and things of that nature, as opposed to the economic development that the Victoria Economic Development Corporation does, which is
Right.
focusing on primary jobs, which is mostly manufacturing and
Sure.
petrochemical.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up to clarify. So the idea is for us to not, get into the business of chasing primary jobs. I mean, that's the role of the VEDC, and the Sales Tax Development Corporation contracts the VEDC to do that. But there's so much more to economic development. And so the idea is for us to focus on those things, some of which we already do, like you mentioned, the retail coach. Main Street, something that's already been taking place. We would simply sort of bring that in-house. So yes, thank you for clarifying that. But yeah, this would in no way, shape, or form would it sort of intervene or conflict with what the VEDC is working on.
Thank you. That was a great presentation.
Do
Appreciate it.
you feel as though this restructuring will give you avenues to have more interaction with staff up and down each level, and therefore clear direction to staff, and then obviously greater expectation?
Sure. Absolutely. There's only so many hours in a day. And again, with a city of our size, it's beneficial to have that second support person. There's, we talked about communications. There's a lot of opportunities to improve communication even with our own employees. Next week, as an example, I'm meeting with the top 100 employees of our organization to sort of start that conversation to improve the communication from the city manager's office down to the other positions. So absolutely, it would definitely help. And it would help with strategic planning. It would help improve relations even with council, to be quite honest with you, also, because again, the time aspect.
Any further questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mayor and council, the next two presentations are mine. Excuse me, the first of the two is a follow-up on the VSTDC information session that happened 2 weeks ago at this meeting when I was not present. There were a couple of items that came up during that meeting that I would have offered clarification for had I been here, and I want to give that tonight as a follow-up to that meeting. The first was a comment by Councilmember Lofgren, who was talking about the city council being the final decision maker with respect to VSTDC. And I want to clarify that, yes, he's right, but I want to put a finer point on that issue. It's true that the city council is the final decision maker for the Sales Tax Corporation. However, the city council created that as an independent organization. It's a development corporation under state law. It has its own board. It establishes its own budget. It adopts its own projects, and it approves its own expenditures. So that board has the independence to make their own decisions. It is the city's practice for the city administration to ask every year for that board to make contributions towards city infrastructure projects that are economic development projects. And typically that board approves those requests. However, I do want to clarify that the board has independent review. Now, the reason Mr. Lofgren is correct in his statement that the city council has final authority over that is because, of course, you know, state law says that the authorizing entity, the city council that created sales tax corporation, gets to approve the projects and expenditures of the corporation. And so essentially you have veto authority. City council cannot tell VSTDC what projects to adopt. But if VSTDC adopts a project, then it comes to you for approval of that project, and you can choose to vote it down. All right, you can't tell them what to do, but you can tell them what they can't do. Okay, so that's that clarification. The other point that came up last meeting, and I've talked briefly with Councilmember Balknight about this already, is a comment that he made about economic development through job training programs. If I can get some help passing these out. I'll keep one of these for myself, just so I can refer to it. And while he's passing that out, I'm going to give a little disclaimer right quick, primarily for the public's information. As you all know, I serve not only as the city attorney, but also as the attorney for VSTDC. So I wear two hats. Just like I give advice to City Council, I give advice to VSTDC. This memo represents some of that advice. I need to say publicly for the record that this advice was given to a different client, VSTDC, and that they have voted publicly to waive attorney-client privilege with respect to this memo, which allows me to share it with you. So I don't want anyone, whether they're sitting at this dais or in the general public, to think that I'm just handing out confidential legal advice that I gave to one of my clients. So what Councilman Balknight said at the last meeting was that I had previously given an opinion that jobs training programs were illegal. And he's referring to this memo when he says that. This memo was requested by the president of the Sales Tax Corporation, Louis Neitch, and it was written to him. It was written in response to a request from the Midcoast Construction Academy for funding for a jobs training program that they wanted to put on. At Louis Neitch's request, I analyzed that project, analyzed the state law under which that project could potentially be funded, and ultimately concluded that it was a stretch for that project to be funded under state law. Council Balknight asked for a copy of that opinion at that time. Louis Neitch approved that I release that opinion to him, and Council Balknight requested that I get a second opinion because he disagreed with my conclusions. At his request, I did get a second opinion from the Comptroller's Office. They have an economic development division that is in charge of overseeing these dollars. And the opinion that I got there was the same conclusion, but a slightly different analysis. If you'll do me a favor and flip to the second page, it's printed two-sided, so we're talking about the back of the first sheet of paper. The third paragraph begins with the phrase, "The second category of job training projects," quote, 163 projects. Just put a star next to that paragraph right quick, or some other way to mark it, so that when you're reading this later, you'll remember that that's the section where the comptroller's opinion was slightly different than mine. And then I'll explain what the difference is. And I'm not going to dive into the detail of all of this, but I do want to say there are two areas where potentially you could use sales tax money to do job training programs. One of them is a 162 project. And that is when a company comes to you and asks for your help funding job training for employees that they guarantee they will create new job positions for. The reason that, in my opinion, the Midcoast Construction Academy did not qualify as a 162 project was because they were not promising that they would create any new jobs. What they were offering to do was to train existing workforce and to make those people available to industry for other people to create new jobs. And so it didn't quite fit the way the law was structured. There's a second section called 163 projects that may or may not apply. And when I got a second opinion from the comptroller's office, the comptroller believes that 163 does not apply at all because of a separate section of code. And so I could go into that in greater detail, but I just want to point out to you today that if I were rewriting this memo, I would defer to the opinion of the state agency charged with enforcing it, which is the state comptroller's office. And so I wouldn't have written the sections of this the sections of this memo that describe 163 projects. It is a stretch to get there, and I was just trying to cover all bases in my memo. So the point of this is to point out to you that I did look at the issue of job training programs from VSTDC. It was my opinion then, it is my opinion now, that VSTDC can spend money on jobs training programs, just like Mr. Garza said, provided the right project comes along. And this project simply wasn't the right project. I'll answer any questions on that, but that's really not intended to be the focus of my presentation tonight.
My only question is then how across the state do other EDCs participate in the same type of programs?
Not being their attorney and not reviewing those programs, obviously I can't give legal advice with regards to how they accomplish that goal. And I know that's a dodge, and unfortunately,
Oh, I
it's the
know,
best I
yeah.
can say.
Yeah, I just know it's done elsewhere in the state with similar programs that MCA was modeled after.
Right? They told me such at the time. And when I shared with them in a private meeting, I met with their directors, and I shared with them my concerns and showed them the documentation that I would need in order to be able to sign off on this. They did provide additional documentation, but it didn't accomplish the goal that I said the law needed them to accomplish, which was to guarantee that they would hire people.
I still don't agree with it in some part because I don't think it expressly forbids it. I don't think it expressly allows it either. And so you're left in a gray area, and I operate in a business, and if you're told you can't do it, you can't do it, or you told, it's against the law, it's against the law.
Gray as a yellow light.
Yeah. So I still think it's legal, but
I understand.
I have an opinion too.
Did you write a memo?
No, mine would be a lot shorter.
My second presentation has to do with proposals to streamline council meetings, and I have a printout of my PowerPoint if you'd like to follow along. Tom Halapasco, when he was a council member, used to often make jokes, and one of his regulars was to talk about the speed of government as the glacial speed of government. What I want to do tonight is to make a series of proposals that I think will help speed up that glacial speed of government. In fact, the proposals that I'm going to make tonight will improve our reaction speed, our ability to conduct business by about 3 weeks, meaning that some projects that currently take a month to complete could take a week. And I think that's a significant improvement. And so as I go through the proposals tonight, I'm not asking for a final decision. This is just a city manager's report. What I'm asking for is for essentially your consent to bring back formal resolutions at the next business meeting where you can make a final decision then. Let's talk about the ideas tonight. We can refine the ideas, and I can bring back a formal proposal in writing at our next meeting. So here's the idea. It currently takes 3 weeks to prepare the packet for this meeting, the agenda packet that includes the resolutions and all of the documents. Now, I know that's a long time, and I know that we are currently rolling out some administrative changes behind the scenes that'll try to tighten that up quite a bit, I think. But looking at it the way we currently have this meeting set up, it takes 3 weeks to prepare the packet for you. And that's measured from the time that a department completes a contract that they want to get approved to the time that you guys approve it. Take, for example, the janitorial services contract that's on your agenda tonight that you approved. Thank you. In order to meet our timeline, that contract had to be negotiated, reviewed, approved, and signed by the other party 3 weeks ago before you could approve it tonight. Take that a step further. Any item of business that doesn't need to come to city council for approval doesn't have to wait those 3 weeks. So if that janitorial services contract for $29,000 didn't require city council approval, we could have signed the contract 3 weeks ago and already been in operation. That's the improvement that I'm talking about. But it's not just a single contract, it's a broader concept. If you expand that beyond a single issue, what we're really talking about is that by reducing the number of routine business items that come before council on your regular council agenda, we are streamlining and making a more efficient business operation across the organization. So the proposals that I'm bringing tonight, you can see where I'm going with this. I'm going to be asking you to consider delegating more authority to the administration to deal with routine business items so that they don't have to come to city council for approval. There are exact 3 proposals that I'm actually going to make. The first is to increase the city manager's contract authority. The second is to delegate authority over certain grants to the city manager. And the third is to delegate authority to correct Scrivener's errors to the city attorney. Let's talk about each one of those in turn. First, the city manager's contract authority. City council already delegated authority to the city manager. Way back in 2001, city council delegated what I think is pretty broad. Here's the summary of the resolution itself. Resolution 2001-130R authorized the city manager to execute contracts up to $25,000, insurance contracts to $5,000, and various real estate transactions as well. It was limited only to budgeted items. That's items that have previously gone to council through the budget process and been approved by council in the budget. And then the city manager was required to report back to council any time that a contract was executed pursuant to that authorization. That's why in your read file every meeting, you have a list of all of the contracts that have been executed by the city manager. If you're a history buff, here's the interesting part. In 2001, state law said that any contract over $25,000 for a local entity had to go through the state purchasing competitive bidding requirements. Anything over $25,000. And any insurance contract greater than $5,000 had to go through competitive bidding, all under state law. So what that means is city council was really telling the city manager, we're giving you authority to conduct business that's already gone through the budget up to the limit of the state purchasing bidding requirements. It created a 2-tiered approach to contracting. Anything that was below the threshold could be approved by the city administration. Anything that was above the threshold had to be competitively bid and came to council for consideration. The story gets more interesting, though, because the state legislature later, I think, realized that $25,000 doesn't buy what it used to. And in 2003, they removed the $5,000 cap on insurance contracts. And in 2007, they raised the bidding threshold to $50,000 where it is today. City council in Victoria never followed suit. And so by default, by not taking action, city council created now a 3-tiered system that we follow today, where anything below $25,000 can be handled by the city manager. Anything between $25,000 and $50,000 doesn't have to be bid at the state contracting level, but it does need to come to council. And then anything above $50,000 has to go through the full formal process of formal bidding and formal council approval. I'd like to see us collapse that back down to 2 tiers. I think it would be significantly more efficient for government if the city manager had authority to approve contracts up to $50,000. Now, I've been talking about routine business items, and I want to show you what I mean. The items that would have been affected in 2018, calendar year 2018, are these. Out of the 192 resolutions, there were 122 that approved contracts. Out of those 122 contracts, 46 of them were between $25,000 and $50,000 and could have been handled by the city manager's office. Of those 46, staff put 22 of those items on the consent agenda, meaning we thought they were routine business that would be approved by council without discussion. But council actually approved 43 of them without discussion. Yes, I asked a staff person to go back and watch all the videotapes, and she actually counted them for me. Thank you, Brandy. That was probably not an easy job. The vast majority of those items are routine business. Council does not discuss it. They come up either on the consent agenda or on the regular action items agenda, and they get approved without discussion. We're holding up contracts for 3 weeks for items that rarely get discussed at council. If we were to move to increasing the city manager's contract authority up to $50,000, we could greatly eliminate that time frame for a significant number of contracts that the city enters into. I would recommend that we also continue to require notice from the city manager's office to city council of any contract that's been executed under that authority, and I apologize for the typo there. That way you would still be getting notice of all of those items. I did not include it on the slide, I'm sorry, but I would still recommend that this is only for items that are previously budgeted. So you've already had a chance to review them through the budget process, and you've ostensibly already approved them. And then the final budget item on that list was requested by Mayor McCoy, and I think it's a good idea, to require council approval of any contract with a former council member. You might ask, why not current council members? Because there's a charter provision that says that if we enter into a contract with you, you forfeit your seat on council and quickly become a former council member. So we don't enter into contracts with current council members. And there is some concern about whether or not there are contracts with former council members. So let's have those approved in public, and I think that makes sense. So that's the first recommendation that I'm making from you. Do you want me to pause here for questions, or do you want to wait till the end? Ms. Scott?
If you're going to throw in the caveat about former council members, that just kind of brings to mind other issues. Is there already a prohibition or procedure for employees, and is there a limit to family of employees? Is that an issue for us?
It is not. Let me come back to you next week when I make the formal presentation, because I didn't reread that section of the charter closely enough to remember it off the top of my head. There are provisions related to employees and contracts. There's also, of course, the personnel policy manual that's related to things like that. And so I could give you a more thorough answer next week.
I would think it's probably covered, but it just kind of begs the question.
I agree with you that I think it's probably covered, but I don't want to speak out of turn.
Thank you.
Sure.
If I might ask, Mr. Gooch, even though these contracts are approved by the administration, in effect, all applicable Ethics Commission requirements,
Would still be complied with. That's
the
correct.
questionnaires,
That's right.
conflict of interest questionnaires, all those things that are set up by the state for ethics reasons are all applicable.
That is actually a very good point. Yes, all of the ethics rules, including conflicts of interest, nepotism, all of those things would still apply to all of those contracts. There is one very small change that might be impacted by this, and Mayor McCoy and I have talked about this as well. There's a specific conflict of interest disclosure form that contractors have to fill out if the contract gets approved by council, or if it's more than $1 million. And so those contracts that are less than $1 million that no longer are approved by council, they won't have to fill out that form. It's not a significant time impact on the city itself. It doesn't take long for us to manage that process, but there is a small impact there, yes.
What's your formal definition of routine business?
I don't think I have a formal definition.
Well, I think it would have to be defined pretty well.
I think he was saying if it was already approved within the budget, if it was a budgeted item.
So let's take, for example, we recently approved library rooftop units to be changed out.
Okay.
I want to remember that it was less than 50,000, but there was a huge savings because we went out to bid. We'd be losing that by doing this.
Well, I don't know whether we would necessarily be losing that, because remember that we still are subject to a purchasing procedure manual within the city. And the procedure, the purchasing manual, Gilbert could probably speak to it in more detail if he would like, still requires 3 bids to be submitted or 3 quotes to be submitted on projects over a certain dollar figure. I don't remember exactly what that threshold is. And so on projects like that, you would still have multiple quotes before that contract got approved.
So I thought earlier in the presentation that you'd talked about the state's authority not requiring bids
Yeah, so
up to
that's,
50,000.
that's
So-
different. The state requirement is referring to things like RFPs, RFQs,
That's
not soliciting quotes. So the state,
That's
so the state level of $50,000 says you have to competitively bid it, meaning you have to put a packet together and people read it and then they submit something based off of it. And there's, of course, caveats with professional services,
Of
and all
course.
sorts of things.
All those limitations.
But that's completely different than the soliciting quotes to, replace ACs or.
Which is purely
That's an
illegal.
RFP.
No, it's not.
Well, it doesn't.
Currently, now I don't know historically how we call things, but I can tell you that the way it's supposed to work is that under the state statute is that anything below 50 is not RFP'd. Typically, it's only everything above 50,000 is RFP'd. Now, there's some professional services that have to get RFQ, but that's different. But for something that's like a construction project or equipment or something to that effect, there's a difference.
Well,
And
before
then-
I can move forward with this, then I need to see how that's all broken out, because I
Sure.
don't have any definition by Mr. Gooch's admission. There's not a definition of routine business. So anybody could make up what routine business is. Different city manager,
Let me clarify that because I don't have a definition of the phrase routine business, but the scope of the authority would be defined by the resolution. There would be a formal resolution adopted by council, just like there was in 2001, that sets the exact parameters of what the city manager's authority is. And so I'm using the phrase routine business as just a casual reference to describe what these items are. I don't intend for that to be a defined term. The definition of what the authority is comes from the scope of the resolution that we'll draft and council will consider for approval.
And nobody clearly defines routine business versus not, because it's based off of projects that are already approved in the budget, like the janitorial contract that was on the agenda today, that was what,
$29,700.
$29,000. So that item, as an example, is already in the budget because council already approved the maintenance line item for custodial services. So that's where the term routine is, that it's in the budget already. We're meeting the expectations of council by doing custodial services as approved in the budget. So why do we have to wait 3 weeks? That's kind of the thought behind it. But to your point,
did we go out
though,
for pricing on some of that? I mean,
But,
that's,
but to your point on the purchasing, we'd be glad to have a much broader presentation for educational purposes, for council to understand our purchasing procedure and how it kind of connects to all of this. Because certainly the intention isn't to the intention is simply to save time and make us more efficient. It's not to try and, avoid doing certain things, from a competitive standpoint or getting quotes or things of that sort. So I just want to make it very clear that the intent here is simply to be more efficient with the things that are already approved in the budget, and that's it. Now, I realize that for education purposes, it might be important for us to educate you and the public on everything that we do from a purchasing standpoint. We'd be glad to do that.
it's not that, it's how it fits into this,
Right.
right? It's not just, your whole purchasing procedures, but what you're asking me to do as a representative of my district is to put more trust in the bureaucracy. That's what you're asking
Right.
for.
Actually, it's
And
what I'm
I
asking
don't
for.
I don't take that answer from me lightly to that
Sure.
question. You're asking to take away power from the people that are up here that represent the community and put more trust. And I don't have a definition for routine business. I don't understand what's gonna fall under this $50,000. I don't understand what's gonna change with bidding. You say nothing, but I wanna see all that in front of me before I can make a decision on
Councilman
it.
Bogdan, how about at the next meeting, I bring back for you a draft agenda that spells out exactly what the scope of that authority would be. And I bring back for you a list of what 46 resolutions in 2018 would have been approved administratively so that you can review those and see whether or not any of those would have caused you heartburn.
Yep, and I'm sure they're gonna be all the chemical lists that Allison likes to read.
Those are not always under 50.
Yeah, those are,
That's
Yeah.
2 weeks from now,
Slightly,
and most of those are
slightly.
more than 20, yeah.
I'd still like to know the procurement process.
Sure.
But you said, at some point, you said that we're basically in a three-tiered process right now.
That's right.
That under 25,000 right now, that's been delegated.
Correct.
Between 25 and 50, state law says it doesn't have to be
Competitively bid.
competitively bid. State law currently says that. You're
That's
aware of
correct.
that.
Correct,
And above 50,000, it does.
correct.
So can I read between those lines that you're not necessarily, and this is kind of going to the procurement, that you're not necessarily competitively bidding things between 25 and 50, even though they have to come to council?
That's correct. There's not a current requirement internally that we follow the state procurement system of competitive bidding for items less than $50,000. Our purchasing manual is not the same as competitive procurement.
Now, is there also a possibility that you do put things out for bid, even though they don't have to be put out for bid? If it makes sense, I mean, is our staff aware of situations and, uses?
That would be up to
Their
the discretion
abilities.
of the department, and Mr. Garza may want to address that.
Well, I was just gonna say that, I mean, absolutely, right? But ultimately, that's why you hire me, and that's why we hire professional staff to make the best judgment in terms of what we think is in the best interest of you and the citizens and the funds that ultimately we're responsible for. So yes, absolutely, there has to be a certain level of trust, with me as your city manager, and obviously conversely with all the directors and finance director and everybody involved with the process. And I'm definitely all for trying to do whatever is necessary to ensure that that level of trust is there. And so if it means, coming back and providing more educational sessions on these things, absolutely. We've got nothing to hide. We're simply trying to make our government be more efficient.
I think the key word is formal bid process. I think what most entities adopt is a less formal deal of just receiving quotes without the advertising and all those requirements to do it. But all of the state requirements, if it's, thank goodness for a municipality, if it's $50,000 and it's construction, they have to have payment bonds, all of those things that are built in to protect are still there. You just do it in a less formal way. And perhaps that's what when we review or you present the city's purchasing procedures, we'll be able to see that. Is I think what you
Yeah,
want to see.
and don't think
We
that I
all
don't
wanna
trust you,
see it,
Mr.
and we all
Garza,
wanna see
when I say, putting more trust in the bureaucracy. But I look at it as a big picture. You said the last time we had changed this was in 2001.
One.
So we've had a couple of city managers. I'm looking for the bigger picture, not just short-term, whether it would work right now. So I'm looking 10 years from now, is it still gonna work?
Well, 10 years from now, the state might change it to 100.
They might, but I'm saying, whatever we have in place and whatever we choose to go forward with, I wanna make sure that it works for whoever else is sitting up here in 10 years.
Sure.
That's what I'm thinking. 25,000 in 2001 was a lot of authority. 50,000, I mean, we might ask Mr. Rainier to give us the present value of 25,000.
I tried to look it
Or
up
the
already,
present
but
value
the page wouldn't load.
in 2001.
Well, to your point, if we're careful and adopt a good procedure that everybody can live with and we understand the safeguards involved with it, then it's easier just to change the numbers as the
Does-
state does it.
Now for clarification, the procurement manual and policy that we have, does that come to council here?
It was
don't-
signed, no, it was internal by the city
That's what I
manager.
thought. So, going back to your trust question, ultimately, it's my job to do that, right? So it's my job to ensure that we're following an appropriate procedure, that purchasing, which as a matter of fact, we're in the process of updating it, that gets implemented, right?
Right.
So yeah, ultimately, that's my job to do that. But anyway, and trust me, I don't see it as you not trusting me. I realize it's a big ask. But we think it could. One of the things that we haven't talked too much about is, I mentioned in my presentation about the reactive versus proactive. I wish there was a way to literally determine how many hours staff spends putting these 40-plus agenda items together, and how much time that takes away from them from being able to do their every other day jobs. That's a factor that is hard to calculate, but that's part of all of this is, right? How can we alleviate some man-hours of staff focused on bureaucracy-related items so they can focus more on proactive initiatives, they can focus more on planning, they can focus more on responsiveness, they can focus more on management, on leadership, all these things, and so that's kind of the angle that at least I see it in is, a bureaucratic entity is not an innovative one. Bureaucracy and innovation are kind of not synonymous to each other. And so the idea is I want to create an innovative environment, and a lot of these things kind of hold us back from that. So there's definitely more to it.
And I think that's an important point, and I can tell you that I have looked within my own department at the amount of staff time that it takes to prepare a paper packet and deliver it around town, and it's a significant amount of time and a significant number. At some point in the future, I would like to propose a return to electronic packets, but we're not ready to propose that yet because I have not yet seen a technical solution that's going to overcome some of the hurdles that we experienced the last time that we tried an electronic packet. But I do want you to be aware that we are looking behind the scenes at other alternatives that may make this process even easier. So if I can kind of crystallize where we are in the current discussion, what I'm hearing from council is no real opposition to bringing back something to look at next week in writing. It may not get a unanimous approval next week, and I'm comfortable with that. But at least let's put something on paper that would more clearly define, accompanied by some additional background information for consideration. And I'll bring this item back at a future meeting. Let me talk about the second proposal tonight. And they get easier, by the way. The first one was the hard one. Okay. The second one is delegating grant authority. As far as I know, the city council has never delegated authority to anyone to accept gifts or grants at any dollar level. All right. By the way, for definitional purposes, the difference between a gift and a grant is whether it has strings attached. If Councilmember Scott wants to gift $3 million to the city
10 million.
and simply deposit it into the
I
fund.
can only do 8, so 3 would be
right.
reasonable.
3 is okay? All right. That's a gift. But if she says, I will give $3 million to the city so long as they use that money to build XYZ, then it's a grant.
That's what I would do.
Okay?
Absolutely.
And I am not, in this discussion, I'm not concerned with whether or not there's an application process or any of those things. That's the distinction I'm making between gift or grant, okay? Since there has never been a delegation of that authority, those all come to city council. All right. And let's throw up the same numbers as we did before. In 2018, there were 13 of those. 9 could have been approved administratively if you gave the city manager approval to accept grants at that same $50,000 threshold. Okay. 9 could have been approved administratively. 5 were on the consent agenda. 7 were approved without discussion. Now, I want to point out here, there may be some hesitancy to take these off of the agenda because it's a great opportunity when they are on the agenda to give thanks where thanks is due. And I do not intend to take that opportunity away. I would, however, point out that could be done during items from council. It could be done during city manager's reports. We don't have to have a formal resolution approving the grant. If we have a grant that's been given to the city and we have to wait 3 weeks before we can say yes, some of those grant opportunities might not be available. I can't point to any opportunity, any time that has actually happened, but it is a concern of mine. So my recommendation here would be to delegate authority to accept all gifts to the city manager. Remember, there's no strings attached on gifts. If somebody wants to donate money, let the city manager say, I accept. And then if there is a grant
And you can trust that I will not turn free money away.
Well, I was just gonna say, you might wanna reword that all gifts to the city, or something.
are
instead of
approved,
just-
yeah, that's true. It's not just a gift to the city manager.
Yeah, I got a nice Beamer waiting for me outside, right?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, and then for grants, I would say that the threshold would be the same $50,000, looking at the expenditure. So to clarify what I mean by that, let's say there is a grant given to the police department of $40,000 to go buy a squad car. but it requires a city match of $20,000, bringing the total to 60. I think what council is concerned about is what is the city government spending its money on? And so I'm recommending that you look at the total expenditure, not what the grant is or what the city match is. Some grants have no city match, some have a 50-50 match. We would just look at what the total expenditure is in order to decide whether or not that needs to come to council.
And you're using the same 50,000, that's how you arrived at that number?
Exactly. I arrived at that number solely because it would be the same level as the other authority grant.
So all those 13 gifts or grants that were approved by resolutions were all less than 50?
No, 9 of them were less than 50.
But it's grants without matches.
No, there were 2 of those that were gifts, if I remember correctly, and 11 were grants. I don't remember whether the gifts were under or above $50,000, but there were 9 grants that would have been approved administratively because they were less than $50,000.
And I know that I pulled at least one of them simply to say thank you.
Absolutely. And I think that's very
mean, that was
appropriate.
discussion.
And it may very well be an item where you want to say, so long as the, city council is given an opportunity to say thank you at a public meeting, because we really do appreciate the community's involvement.
Now, to that point, if I may add, now keep in mind that this, in 2018, with this example, these 13 gifts or grants had to be submitted 3 weeks in advance of the meeting date. So again, the timeline and the process is sort of not efficient, right? So somebody comes and says, hey, I want to give you $100,000 for this bike. Oh, thanks. And they say, hey, I want to come present a check. When can I do it? Oh, next month? That's kind of what the process has been. Anyway, just wanted to point that out.
Absolutely. All right. So I will bring that back. I'm not hearing any major heartburn about that issue, so I'll bring that back for formal approval next week or next meeting. And the final one is Scrivener's errors. And this is something that I saw pop up on the International Municipal Attorney Association's website as an example that came out of the city of Houston. And I like this as an idea, so I'm proposing it here. It's not quite the same advantage because it's not going to reduce the amount of work that's coming to city council. It has a slightly different impact. But city council has never delegated authority to anyone to correct typos, misspellings, misnumberings, or Scrivener's errors in the city code. And I can tell you that what happens, since we have to bring them all back to city council if we want to correct something, is we don't bring them back unless we really need to. I'll give you a good example of that. When we did the game room ordinance, I made a mistake on a cross-reference. I said it's a crime to violate another section of the code which didn't have anything to do with the obligations of the game room operator. It was just a misreference. Thankfully, we were bringing that back to you a month or so later anyway, and so we just corrected it right away when we adopted it, all right? But there are, I don't know how many things in our code that currently have misspellings, typos. Scrivener's error, by the way, is something that is just, a Scrivener is the person who writes it down. It's a clerk, right? And so if the person wrote it down wrong, April and I were looking at some 1909 minutes, handwritten minutes last week, because there was a question about whether the Scrivener, the person who wrote it down, meant 14 or 16. Clearly in our minute books, it was 14 overwritten with a 16. Unless it was a 16 that was overwritten with a 14. We're not sure exactly what that means, okay? It was 1909. So how do we fix those things? Currently, we have to bring those back to council. In the city of Houston, they don't refer to it as Scrivener's errors. They simply say non-substantive errors, and they list out a series of them. Can be corrected by the city attorney by filing a memo with the city secretary, and those things can just be cleaned up without actually having to bring a formal amendment back to council. And so I'm asking that you consider delegating to the city attorney the authority to make non-substantive corrections to the city code. Right. Collectively, those 3 proposals, I think, make a significant impact. You're talking about a 30% decrease in the total number of resolutions that would come to council, right? That frees up council to spend less time focusing on the minutia of city business And I think more time to spend focused on the big picture guidance issues, setting the course for the city manager to carry out. I think, personally, I believe that's the role of city council, is to provide that big picture guidance. And I think if we free you up to be spending less time on the minutia, you'll have more time to focus on those big picture changes. Any questions? Thank you, council.
I'm all for getting that Scrivener plumbed up now.
There you go. So I guess I'll just reference that the next item will be presented by April.
I just have a brief report on appointments to the Victoria Development Commission. 3 council members need to be appointed to serve on the Victoria Development Commission. Currently, Councilman Young, Councilman Bucknight, and Mayor Pro Tem Solis serve on the commission. City Manager Garza had suggested that we wait on these appointments until after he gave his economic development report at the last regular meeting so that he could discuss the functions of the Development Commission so that everybody understood them better before making these appointments. The packet also included an additional explanation of the Victoria Development Commission that was written by Director Reyna and gave examples of projects that were done in the past. The appointments would allow, the new appointments would expire in June 2021, and Mayor Pro Tem Solis did ask me to announce that she is interested in being reappointed to the commission, so we can bring back a resolution at the next meeting that would include specific names, or we can actually do Thomas's voting at the next council meeting if y'all so desire. So, but
I'll stay on it.
I'm interested in continuing to serve.
I have a question, though. Ms. Solis and Mr. Bachnight are on the Sales Tax Development Board, and I was just wondering, just wanted to throw that out to council if we might want to consider. I don't think Dr. Young is on the Sales Tax Board, but
Correct.
just wondered if we wanted to spread the,
All right, this one never
Spread
meets.
it
So, but don't bother me one way or the other. As long as you don't give me another assignment. That
No,
meets all
we're
the time.
we're saving the library board for.
Well, didn't I hear a recommendation to wait?
Well, there have to be a formal resolution appointing people to the board.
Right.
The point of April bringing that up tonight is simply, we want to try and get a sense for, do we simply bring forward a resolution with the people that are on it? Or does council want to have a discussion of some, on appointments, right? I don't think it's our role as staff to assume appointments for council. Those are things that you should discuss as council. And so that's why this opportunity for y'all to have that discussion, if we simply proceed with the people that are on it, or if y'all want to have a conversation of different people, that's your decision.
I guess the second part of my thought process was, after hearing your presentation and then seeing, I don't think this commission has been active. And so, not changing it is not really an issue. But if you foresee that it may become more active, then, perhaps we do want to look at having different council so that we're all involved in more aspects of it. But that's kind of a question for you as to whether you feel
Sure.
like this might.
Well, and if
become-
you recall from the presentation I gave a couple meetings ago, or last meeting, I don't even remember now. Part of what I want to do is just look at everything, just long-term, look at these corporations that were started in '82, which are these, or this was one of those. And so that's going to take some time to kind of figure out. And there might be others that, we're missing out on.
When is the date that they have to be made, or is there one?
well, their appointments expired in June,
Oh,
so
they already
we're a little
expired.
behind.
But they're held over until,
Yes.
until replaced or reappointed.
Perhaps just a quick update on what this board does, perhaps at the next meeting.
Well, I already provided that at the last meeting,
You got
and
it?
so,
This is a good example in here on explaining what the board does. It gives us the ability to issue bonds,
Right.
right, for a project that then would, or a commercial entity can piggyback on the good credit really of the
Right.
city. They would pay back the bonds, but the city would issue the bonds.
Right.
So it's just a way to, a tool for the economic
Yeah.
development.
And we technically have 2 of these. This specific one is the one related to industrial development. There's actually a separate one, which I think is hospital-focused. So this one's specific to the 3-member board that is industrial development focus. And it was created in 82, as I mentioned when I gave that presentation, so it's been around for a while. But it sounds like what I'm hearing is we'll bring forward a resolution reappointing the folks that are on it, and we'll just keep the council updated as we have this more thorough conversation on overall all the development corporations that we have. We've been talking a lot about economic development.
Okay. Does that wrap up the reports?
Yes, sir.
All right, then, I think the next order of business will recess into executive session?
Yes, sir.
Or is that still on the?
The city council
Yes.
will recess
It should-
now for executive session on the second day of July 2019 at 6:34 PM. The subject matter of the executive session deliberation is as follows: Texas Government Code Section 551.087, to discuss or deliberate the offer of financial or other incentive to a business prospect that the city council seeks to have locate, stay, or expand in or near this territory of the city of Victoria, and with which the city of Victoria is conducting economic development negotiations. Thank you.